Why did some German prisoners claim that life under American guards felt almost comfortable, while others described the French camps as the hardest ordeal they ever faced? The answers do not begin on a battlefield, and they do not start with politics either. They begin with something far more human: fear, uncertainty, hunger, and the shock of realizing that the war they believed would bring victory had instead delivered them into the hands of their enemies. For many of these prisoners, their fate depended entirely on the flag flying above the camp gate. At first, thousands of captured German soldiers expected revenge. After years of propaganda, they believed the Western Allies would treat them with brutality. Instead, their experiences split into three very different stories. The American version, the British version, and the French version each carried its own rules, its own moods, and its own shadows. An emotional divide grew within the same army of prisoners, depending simply on where they ended up. Before we go deeper into their journey, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy real stories from the Second World War. It helps more than you might think, and we will move on quickly. For many prisoners, their first contact with American forces happened under chaotic circumstances. Columns of exhausted men marched toward improvised camps. They expected harshness. Instead, one former prisoner later recalled, quote, "We expected beatings, but the Americans mostly seemed tired and bored," end quote. This did not mean kindness or warmth. It meant routine. For the United States Army, handling hundreds of thousands of prisoners was an enormous logistical challenge, and efficiency mattered more than emotion. American camps varied widely. Some were little more than open fields with barbed wire, where men slept on the ground and waited for food that sometimes arrived late. Others were large, stable facilities with wooden barracks, medical care, and strict but predictable schedules. American guards were often young men who had not developed deep hatred toward Germans on a personal level. Their instructions were clear: maintain order, follow the Geneva Convention, and avoid unnecessary cruelty. This structure created a sense of stability that many prisoners did not expect. However, it was not a paradise. Food shortages existed, especially right after major offensives when the number of prisoners suddenly exploded. But even then, compared to the Eastern Front or the French-controlled camps, many Germans viewed American grounds as something close to relief. The distance from the front lines, the predictable routines, and the lack of emotional hostility shaped these experiences. The British approach carried a different tone. Britain had been bombed for years, cities destroyed, civilians killed. For many guards, the war was not distant, and their memories were fresh. British camps tended to be more disciplined, more formal, and often more psychologically strict. Former prisoners described a sense of cold politeness. You followed the rules, and the rules were many. One prisoner wrote about his first days under British supervision, noting that the guards did not treat them violently. But there was no friendliness either. The feeling was unmistakable. You are the enemy, and this will not be forgotten any time soon. British work requirements were heavier, and the expectations for order were sharper. You did not argue with a British sergeant. You did not test the limits. The atmosphere alone was enough to keep most men in line. Even so, the British generally followed the laws of war. Medical treatment existed. Food was rationed but adequate, and punishments rarely crossed into physical brutality. Many prisoners later admitted that the British camps were strict but fair. Those who followed regulations had little to fear. Yet compared to the Americans, everything felt more controlled, more distant, and certainly less relaxed. The real shock for many captured soldiers came when they entered French custody. France had suffered brutal occupation, the loss of millions, and years of humiliation. The emotional weight was different. The French guards had not forgotten the destruction of their towns, the starvation, and the executions carried out by German forces. As a result, many French-run camps carried an intensity that the prisoners had not experienced elsewhere in the West. Food shortages in France were severe even for civilians. Housing was destroyed, infrastructure ruined, and supplies scarce. When Germany fell, the French suddenly received tens of thousands of prisoners they barely had the resources to feed. Many camps were improvised and lacked proper facilities. The work was heavy, often tied to rebuilding bridges, clearing rubble, restoring farmland, or cutting timber. Conditions were physically exhausting, and rations were sometimes barely enough to maintain strength. Some prisoners described this period as the harshest time of their war. Hunger became constant. The labor felt endless. The resentment from guards was visible. One memoir stated, quote, "The French did not need to tell us why they were angry. You could see it in their eyes every morning," end quote. Despite this, not every French camp was a nightmare. Over time, conditions gradually improved as supply chains stabilized and international pressure increased. But the early months left a lasting impression. As the war ended, the story of captivity became a story of survival. The Americans offered structure, the British delivered order, and the French demanded labor. Three nations with three different histories created three different realities for the same group of men who had once marched under the same flag. Part 2 will continue with deeper comparisons, personal experiences, daily routines, and the emotional world of the prisoners as they moved from uncertainty to adaptation. The deeper we look into these three systems of captivity, the more we see how much the environment shaped the lives of German prisoners. Their treatment did not depend solely on laws or official policies. It depended on food shortages, the mood of the guards, the destruction suffered by local populations, and even the geography surrounding each camp. For many prisoners, the difference between an American, British, or French camp felt like the difference between three separate worlds. In the American camps, mornings usually began with roll call. Guards checked the numbers, ensured no one had escaped during the night, and handed out the daily rations. Meals varied from camp to camp. Sometimes a prisoner might receive canned meat, potatoes, bread, or soup made from whatever ingredients were available. At other times, especially in temporary or overcrowded camps, meals were far more limited. Yet even when food was scarce, prisoners later recalled that the Americans maintained a certain level of predictability. You always knew approximately when the meals arrived and what the schedule looked like. Work details in American custody ranged from simple maintenance tasks inside the camp to agricultural labor outside the wire. Many German prisoners worked on farms throughout the Midwest and the South. For the first time in years, they tasted a sense of normal life that war had stripped away. Farmers treated them with a mixture of caution and curiosity, and some prisoners were surprised to discover that American civilians did not view them with hatred. Instead, they saw them as young men caught in the machinery of war. A former prisoner later wrote that working on a farm in Kansas felt strange, but almost peaceful. He remembered the silence of the fields compared to the chaos of the front. He recalled the unexpected kindness of a farmer's family who offered water on hot days and spoke with him through broken English. These small interactions created memories that lasted long after the war. They became a powerful contrast to the harshness that some prisoners later faced in French labor camps. The British experience felt different. British camps were organized with military precision. The guards had clear instructions, and obedience was non-negotiable. There was a sense of controlled formality that left many prisoners feeling like they had stepped into a world where emotions were kept behind a strict wall. The British were not cruel, but they did not hide that the prisoners were responsible for the destruction of British cities and the loss of so many civilian lives. Daily routines in British camps often included compulsory work, but the atmosphere was less relaxed than in the United States. Prisoners worked on farms, in workshops, or in construction tasks that supported local infrastructure. Some recalled that British civilians showed more visible resentment than Americans did. The memories of the Blitz were still fresh. The ruins of bombed neighborhoods stood as a constant reminder of why the war had been fought. One prisoner described walking past London's destroyed buildings while being transported to a work site. He wrote that every broken brick felt like a silent accusation. Still, he admitted that the guards did not abuse them physically. Instead, the discipline, the sharp commands, and the heavily structured schedules created a psychological pressure that stayed with many prisoners long after their release. When it came to France, the conditions were shaped by a country that had suffered deeply. French camps often relied on forced labor to rebuild what had been destroyed. Bridges needed to be repaired, rail lines cleared, farmland restored, and forests managed. Many camps were not properly equipped to house or feed the thousands of prisoners who suddenly arrived after Germany's collapse. Hunger became one of the defining features of the French captivity. Work in French custody was physically demanding. Prisoners cut timber in cold forests, cleared battlefields still littered with dangers, and moved heavy stones to repair walls and roads. They worked long hours with limited rest, and the food rations, especially in the early months, were far below what a working man required. Malnutrition set in. Fatigue grew. French guards, carrying years of anger and trauma, often showed little sympathy. This was not simply military discipline. It was personal. That said, it is important to remember that not every French camp was brutal. Some improved with time. Once the French government stabilized and international pressure from the Western Allies increased, food supplies gradually rose and housing conditions improved. But for many prisoners, the early period left scars both physical and emotional. As these experiences unfolded, friendships formed among the prisoners themselves. Some men held onto their pride, refusing to show weakness. Others broke under the strain. The mix of personalities created tensions and alliances that defined daily life inside the camps. A man who had felt strong on the battlefield could feel powerless behind the wire. Another who had feared combat found unexpected resilience in captivity. The emotional world of the prisoners was complicated. Many struggled with guilt, wondering whether their families were still alive under the ruins of German cities. Others felt anger at their own commanders, who had led them into a war that now ended in hunger and humiliation. and many simply felt relief to be alive at all. For them, captivity was not the worst fate. It was a chance to hope for a future beyond the war. Even among these personal stories, patterns emerged. The Americans represented stability. The British represented discipline. The French represented payback and hardship. These impressions, drawn from thousands of individual memories, shaped how the prisoners remembered their time in captivity. In the next part, we will look deeper into daily routines, work assignments, relationships with guards, and how different nations balanced justice, revenge, and humanity in the treatment of their prisoners. We will also explore more personal accounts, some surprising kindness, some difficult truths, and the emotional divide that defined the last years of the war for so many captured soldiers. As months passed inside these camps, German prisoners learned how to adapt to three very different worlds. Daily life became a rhythm of survival, routine, and observation. Some prisoners tried to keep track of days by carving marks into wooden posts or keeping hidden notes. Others simply let time blur into a long, uncertain period that mixed hunger, work, and constant reflection. Inside American camps, the daily pattern slowly became familiar. Roll call, meals, work details, rest periods, and evening gatherings formed the structure of each day. Even prisoners who disliked the monotony admitted that the structure gave them something they had lacked during the final chaotic months of the war: predictability. This sense of order mattered. It helped men focus on the future rather than their immediate fears. Work assignments in American custody often involved repairing fences, cleaning facilities, or working on local farms. These farm assignments became one of the most defining features of the American prisoner experience. Many guards preferred sending prisoners to agricultural work because it reduced the burden inside the camp and supported local communities. Farmers across the country faced labor shortages due to the war, and German prisoners filled this gap. A former prisoner later described how, during harvest season, he and a small group were transported to a rural farm where they worked from sunrise to sunset. He recalled the surprising mixture of caution and humanity from the farmers. They did not trust him at first, but they did not hate him either. He remembered receiving fresh water in the shade of a barn and feeling, for the first time since his capture, like a human being rather than a defeated soldier. Experiences like this deeply influenced the way many German prisoners remembered American captivity long after the war. British camps offered a more formally controlled structure. Work assignments were planned with military precision. Prisoners rebuilt damaged infrastructure, cleared bombed areas, and supported agricultural needs, much like in American camps. But in Britain, the atmosphere was sharper. Orders were delivered with clear authority. Discipline was enforced consistently. Guards did not shout unless necessary, yet their tone carried weight and expectation. British civilians sometimes treated prisoners with noticeable distance. The Luftwaffe bombings had taken an emotional toll on the British public. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed. Children had been killed. Streets still carried the scars of the Blitz. When German prisoners were marched through nearby towns, the silence from civilians could feel heavy. Some stared with bitterness, others with curiosity, and a few with a sense of moral victory. Still, many prisoners later described the British approach as disciplined rather than cruel. Medical care, while limited, was accessible. Rations were small but fair. Punishments existed but rarely crossed the line into physical abuse. For those who followed the rules, British camps were survivable, though emotionally cold. The emotional contrast became most visible in French custody. The French camps were shaped by a country that had suffered deeply under occupation. Many French guards had lost family members, homes, or entire villages. The emotional wounds were fresh and personal. As a result, the prisoners often felt the weight of this anger even without physical violence. Daily routines in French camps were exhausting. Work began early and ended late. The tasks were often physically heavy: clearing rubble in destroyed towns, repairing bridges blown apart during the fighting, restoring farmland that had been neglected for years, or cutting timber in remote forests. The rations were minimal during the first months, leaving many prisoners weak and malnourished. Fatigue often turned into despair. One former prisoner recalled standing in line for food in a French camp and feeling the shock of hunger ripple through the men around him. He said that the French guards were not always brutal, but their resentment was visible. Their silence carried more weight than shouting. Every day reminded the prisoners that France was rebuilding from devastation inflicted by their own army. However, even within these harsh realities, moments of humanity existed. Some French guards softened over time, especially as the camps became more organized. Local civilians, once they saw prisoners working to rebuild their towns, sometimes showed cautious tolerance. Small gestures, like a leftover piece of bread or a quiet word of understanding, created emotional relief in a landscape defined by hardship. Across all three powers, the relationships between prisoners and guards developed in complex ways. Some guards viewed the prisoners as dangerous enemies. Others saw them simply as defeated soldiers trying to survive. And a few felt sympathy for young men who had been caught in a war larger than themselves. These relationships, whether harsh or humane, shaped the daily emotional landscape of captivity. Inside the camps, the prisoners themselves developed their own social structures. They organized small groups for sharing food, telling stories, or supporting each other during sickness. Some men acted as unofficial leaders, helping maintain morale. Others withdrew into isolation. A few attempted escape, though escape attempts in Western Europe were rare compared to the Eastern Front, mainly because most prisoners realized that life inside the camp was better than starving while trying to cross foreign terrain. As weeks turned to months, the emotional divide between camps became clear. Prisoners in American custody often wrote letters home describing stable conditions and structured routines. Those in British custody described discipline and formality. Those in French custody described hunger, exhaustion, and unpredictable moments of resentment. And through all of this, one universal truth remained. Captivity forced men to confront not just their circumstances, but also themselves. Many prisoners spent long nights reflecting on their choices, their beliefs, and the war that had brought them to this point. Letters home, when allowed, carried both hope and pain. Some prisoners worried about their families living among the ruins of German cities. Others hoped that captivity meant they might survive the war after all. In Part 4, we will go deeper into these emotional and psychological transformations. We will explore how the prisoners coped with homesickness, guilt, friendship, religious faith, and the long silence from home. We will also look at how the end of the war changed their status, their treatment, and ultimately their journey back to a Germany they no longer recognized. As the war moved toward its end and finally collapsed in 1945, the emotional lives of the prisoners became more complicated than ever before. News drifted into the camps slowly, through guards, newspapers, or rumors carried by new arrivals. Some men refused to believe that Berlin had fallen. Others accepted it quietly, understanding that their personal war had ended the moment they surrendered. But the official end of the conflict did not mean the end of captivity. In many ways, it created a new phase of uncertainty. Inside American camps, a noticeable shift began. Guards relaxed slightly, administrative routines grew smoother, and some restrictions eased now that the fighting had stopped. Prisoners sensed the change. The gunfire in Europe had fallen silent, yet the wire fences still stood. Many men wondered how long they would remain behind them. The Americans began preparing for large-scale repatriation, but logistics were slow. Europe was in ruins. Transport ships were limited. The United States needed time to return hundreds of thousands of prisoners to a continent struggling to stay alive. During these months, the emotional landscape of American captivity changed from fear to anticipation. Some prisoners joined educational programs offered by the Americans, learning English or studying trades. Others used the downtime to read books, write letters, or participate in camp theater groups. These activities created pockets of normal life within the wire. For many prisoners, they were reminders that the world outside still held opportunities, that the future could be different from the past they had left behind. Across the Atlantic in British camps, the shift felt more controlled. The British had also won the war, but their country remained scarred. Food shortages persisted. Cities needed rebuilding. The British government relied heavily on prisoner labor to support reconstruction and agriculture. As a result, repatriation was delayed for many. German prisoners who had expected to go home quickly found themselves working in fields, repairing damaged infrastructure, or assisting with rebuilding projects across the British countryside. This delay created frustration among prisoners, but the British remained firm. They viewed the labor not as punishment, but as a practical necessity. One prisoner later wrote that he felt torn during this period. On one hand, he wanted desperately to return home. On the other, he understood that the British were trying to rebuild a country still wounded from years of bombing. He admitted that the work, though tiring, was not cruel, and he appreciated the occasional moments of humanity from the guards. The psychological contrast in French camps, however, grew sharper after the war. France was devastated. Entire regions had been stripped of resources during the occupation. Houses, bridges, rail lines, factories, and farms required immediate and extensive rebuilding. The French government depended heavily on prisoner labor, and because of the depth of destruction, they hesitated to release prisoners quickly. This created emotional strain, unlike anything prisoners experienced in American or British custody. In French camps, many men found themselves locked in a state of emotional exhaustion. Hunger, hard labor, and long working hours continued even after the war ended. The rations slowly improved as supply chains stabilized, but the early months left deep physical and psychological scars. Some prisoners wrote about the emotional heaviness that came from working in towns visibly damaged by the German military. These scenes created a silent tension between the prisoners and the guards. Some French guards felt resentment so strongly that even without speaking, Their anger could be felt. Others simply wanted to rebuild their country and viewed the prisoners as a necessary workforce. One former prisoner described his experience clearing rubble in a French town, where civilians watched silently from broken windows and streets lined with destroyed buildings. He remembered a moment when an elderly woman placed a small piece of bread on a stone near the work site and walked away without a word. Gestures like this, rare but deeply meaningful, reminded prisoners that humanity could survive even in the most painful circumstances. As time passed, some French civilians formed complex relationships with the prisoners who helped rebuild their towns. These interactions, while limited, softened the emotional distance. Still, the physical exhaustion of French captivity remained one of the defining features of their experience. Even decades later, many former prisoners recalled their time in France as the hardest period of their lives, more draining than the final months of the war itself. Regardless of where they were held, prisoners across all camps faced internal struggles: guilt, shame, anger, fear, and hope. Some spent nights wondering whether their homes still existed, or whether their families had survived the bombing of German cities. Others felt bitterness toward the Nazi leadership that had led them into a war that ended in disaster. A few clung to ideological beliefs, but most were simply trying to survive, rebuild their sense of self, and imagine a future beyond captivity. Letters from home, when they arrived, carried both relief and heartbreak. Some prisoners learned that their towns were intact and their families alive. Others received messages that their homes had been destroyed, or that loved ones had died in air raids, or that relatives had starved during the winter. These letters changed the emotional atmosphere inside the camps instantly. A joyful letter lifted the spirits of entire barracks. A tragic letter crushed them. Friendships between prisoners grew stronger during this time. Shared suffering created bonds that lasted long after their release. Men relied on each other for emotional support, sharing memories, food, and stories to maintain morale. In some camps, religious services offered comfort, and chaplains, whether prisoners or visiting clergy, helped men process feelings of guilt and loss. The end of the war also brought questions about their own future identity. Many prisoners struggled with how the world would view them when they returned home. Would they be blamed? Would they be welcomed? Would they be seen as victims, perpetrators, or simply survivors? Captivity forced them to confront these questions in ways they had never expected. As the months progressed, the process of repatriation slowly accelerated. The Americans began sending prisoners back earlier than other nations, followed by the British, who phased releases based on labor needs and logistical capacity. The French held on the longest, which created emotional frustration but reflected the enormous burden France carried in rebuilding a country nearly torn apart. In Part 5, the final section, we will follow the journey of repatriation itself. We will explore how the prisoners returned home, how each group remembered their captors, and why the emotional contrast between American, British, and French captivity became one of the most surprising and revealing stories of the Second World War. We will finish with closing reflections and a final reminder to subscribe. The journey home for German prisoners of war did not begin with joy. It began with uncertainty. After years behind wire fences, the idea of returning to a destroyed Germany felt overwhelming. The roads, the cities, and even the governments they had once known no longer existed in the same form. The world had changed. They had changed, and the conditions of their captivity shaped how they stepped back into that world. In American custody, repatriation began earlier than most prisoners expected. The United States had both the resources and the political stability to start releasing prisoners soon after the war ended. Camps grew quieter as groups of men were processed, loaded onto trains, and moved toward ports. The Americans provided medical checks, basic clothing, and food for the long journey. For many prisoners, the departure from American camps carried mixed emotions. They felt relief, but also a strange sense of gratitude toward guards who had treated them with structure and, at times, surprising humanity. Some prisoners later wrote that the moment they stepped out of the camp gates for the final time, they felt as if they were walking out of one life and into another. They were unsure what awaited them, but they knew that captivity under the Americans had given them a chance to survive and rebuild. Years later, many looked back on this period with an unexpected sense of calm. It had not been easy, but it had been predictable, and that predictability had helped them endure. Repatriation from British camps followed a slower timeline. Britain needed labor to rebuild cities shattered by bombings. German prisoners became an essential part of agricultural and reconstruction efforts. Although many prisoners grew frustrated by the delays, their daily work contributed significantly to restoring British infrastructure. When repatriation finally began, it followed a carefully organized process. The British ensured that each prisoner underwent medical evaluations, received identification papers, and was transferred in groups based on transportation capacity. The emotional memories of British captivity were complex. Some prisoners remembered the strict discipline and formal atmosphere. Others recalled specific guards who treated them with fairness and respect. While the British camps were more reserved and structured than the American ones, many prisoners later described them as firm but just. When the time came to return home, they carried with them a sense of having lived through a controlled environment, one that challenged them but did not break them. The experience of returning home from French custody was far more intense. Because France relied heavily on prisoner labor to rebuild the nation, many German soldiers remained in captivity for years after the war had ended. Some were not released until the late 1940s. During this period, work remained physically demanding. Although conditions gradually improved, the emotional strain of long captivity weighed heavily on the prisoners. For many of them, leaving a French camp felt like escaping a world defined by exhaustion and resentment. These men returned home thinner, older, and often haunted by memories of endless labor. Yet even among these prisoners, there were unexpected memories of kindness. Some recalled French civilians who gradually softened, offering small gestures of compassion. Others remembered guards who treated them firmly, but not cruelly, once the initial chaos of liberation had passed. Still, the contrast remained clear. Among thousands of German veterans, the harshest memories almost always came from French labor camps, especially during the chaotic first years. The emotional divide between the three Allied powers solidified into a pattern that shaped how former prisoners spoke about their captivity for decades. When the prisoners finally returned to Germany, they encountered a nation in ruins. Cities were flattened. Families were scattered. Food was scarce. Many men returned to discover that their homes no longer existed, or that relatives had died in air raids or during the final desperate months of the war. The experience of captivity suddenly felt like a continuation of the larger tragedy. Some prisoners struggled with guilt, wondering whether their participation in the war had contributed to the suffering of their own people. Others focused on rebuilding their lives, driven by the simple desire to move forward. Despite this difficult return, the emotional hierarchy of captivity remained remarkably consistent. Former prisoners often described American camps as stable and structured. They remembered British camps as disciplined and emotionally distant, and they remembered French camps as embodiments of hardship, driven by a nation scarred by occupation and destruction. These impressions, repeated in memoirs, interviews, and letters, helped historians understand the profoundly different realities that emerged from the same war. Over the years, some former prisoners revisited the places where they had been held. A few wrote letters to their former guards, expressing gratitude or seeking closure. Some attended reunions held by local communities in the United States or Britain, where they had once worked on farms or construction sites. These reunions often carried a sense of peace. Former enemies shook hands, shared meals, and acknowledged the complexity of their shared history. In contrast, the memories of French captivity remained heavier, shaped by the raw emotional wounds of both the prisoners and the nation itself. While some former prisoners eventually visited France and reconciled with their past, many found the memories too difficult to revisit. The intensity of hunger, exhaustion, and resentment left marks that time could not easily erase. Looking back across the three experiences, one truth becomes clear. Captivity was not a single story. It was three different stories shaped by three countries with three different scars. The Americans offered structure. The British offered discipline. The French demanded labor and carried the emotional weight of occupation. None of these stories are simple. None are entirely heroic or entirely cruel. They are instead the complicated human stories of men who survived the war in ways they never expected. If you enjoyed learning about these real accounts and want to follow more stories from the Second World War, take a moment to subscribe. It helps keep these histories alive and brings more viewers into this journey.